All right, and we are recording. Welcome, Samuel Moyn. This is your debut on Intellect. We are all being very young and in the beginner mindset for a discussion about gerontocracy. Are you excited?
I am.
Let's do it. Let's dive in. I think I first came across this thinking of yours when you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how gerontocracy is kind of eating America. And I loved that I think it's there in the print version as well. You start gerontocracy in America, how the old are hoarding power and wealth and what to do about it. With this really beautiful, and I think for a lot of us, deeply resonant inscription. You say, to the memory of my father and father-in-law, apparently respect for elders is complicated. Should we start a little bit talking about this? Because as with so many books on philosophy, legal philosophy, democracy, it's always worth starting in the family. That's the first arena in life where we encounter hierarchy, rebellion, injustice, having to go to bed too early or eat our greens. How does this duo, your father and father-in-law, come as an inspiration for this book? Just before we dive into it.
Well, it's funny. I don't think I decided to dedicate the book to their memory until very late. But as I was thinking about it, I realized I had written a book about how connected sometimes gerontocracy is to patriarchal authority, which is especially significant, obviously, for the history of women in this world, but also some men who are are under the thumb of their fathers, and much less now than for most of history in most places. One thing that didn't make it in the book is an essay I did in the British magazine called Granta, which is about ethnographies of formal gerontocracy in Africa, where it's not even something you have to guess exists because it's like the formal organization of society. And the author portrays it as just, submission of sons, as well as daughters to fathers and elders. And so, I have to admit that, I didn't get along that well with my father, who didn't raise me. Um, but I really had a lot of love for my father-in-law, who passed away only maybe a year and a month ago. So we were just going through the kind of funeral and mourning process. When like I was finishing this book. So I really, with all authority figures, I think it marks a lot of my work. I have a very oppositional relation. Um, and it's probably thanks to my father and even my father-in-law, whom I really loved and I owed a lot to. We tangled, not, more intellectually. It was part of our fun. So I thought it would be nice to give them the credit for this book.
It's so interesting. I was pleasantly surprised that you start the book with Tocqueville. I mean, not given your professorship, obviously, at Yale, or your Kent Professor of Law and History. I would imagine that maybe it just comes with the territory to have to talk about Tocqueville a little bit. But as an immigrant into the US, or guest, I don't know what I count as these days. I always found that you try to explain to an Eastern European student that, I don't know, American students, PhD students call their advisor Jim, or Angela, depending. And, for us, that feels as sacrilegious as, when you sometimes encounter these hippie kids who call
Right.
their father Bob. You're like, that's so weird. And when we did a Tocqueville reading group on Internetag that was members only, and I made them read the actual book in entirety in six
Mm.
months. And there it comes up that this wasn't a kind of boomer invention necessarily, but it really comes from the founding principles of this country that you should somehow end up at some point calling your professor Jim. But nevertheless, there was a shifting moment. And in some moments in your book, I felt that it's almost as if you were worried that that is being turned back, that there's like a traditionalist kind of a revanchist reactionary force here. So let's talk a
Yes.
little bit about the 20th century. When was the moment when professors became Jim and people decided to live a little bit less hierarchically? And is that really under threat right now? And if so, what does that mean for democracy?
It's in a really interesting way of framing it. I mean, I'm obsessed with Tocqueville and I've taught classes on him and could say a lot about my take on his ideas, which is pretty strange. But maybe, I could and should have written this book about global gerontocracy, because, half of humanity today is living under political leaders older than 70. But what was or basically I was forced to focus on America by the choice to do a kind of American commercial book. Um, but then I thought there could kind of turn that necessity into a virtue by starting with the fact that, America was supposed to be different, and Tocqueville insisted it was different. And as you say, of course, there are some things like informality, students assuming they can call me Sam, which I perfectly am happy for them to do without permission.
Just
That
know
those
that
are,
all the European students are freaking out
of
when you
course,
say
of
that. They're like,
course,
"Oh my God, that's does
of
this
course.
make the whole thing go away? Why am I paying?" You know?
Those are new, and we had the Doktor Vater tradition in the United States too for a long time, but you know nowadays PhD students don't call you doctor or professor, and rightly so. So that there are some new things, but you think you're right to say that Tocqueville observed that somehow this was not surprising happening in America. What I think I'm trying to add is that there are ways in which current developments are taking America not just backwards in time, but more towards the kind of feudal hierarchy, including kind of gerontocracy that America may have been best positioned to escape. And so I do talk a bit about how, like, the founders of America chose some gerontocratic institutions, but that American culture was supposed to be something that provided a world historical exit, from gerontocracy. It's just that now we're in the thick of it, in new ways.
And of course, your previous book, if I'm not mistaken, was like downright about Cold War intellectuals. And
Right.
I often find, of course, you go somewhere and you're an Eastern European woman, then older people immediately think of like Elton John's Nikita. I don't know what they think about, but it feels very old-fashioned and very much not something that you just want to be reminded at every dinner, that it
Right.
existed. But I find that when you talk about the Cold War intelligentsia, those are basically the old people that you then go on to talk about in other contexts in this current book. Do you see these two
Yes.
books as kind of tied in together?
I've thought about it because I wanted most of all with this book to just like quit my earlier career and take a big step beyond what I've worked on, in the past. And it was so much fun for that reason because I don't think anyone had really written on this topic, but I certainly hadn't. And it was an amazing experience to just like throw away all my old books and get a bunch of new ones and think about new questions. But obviously, in the end, I'm pretty old. Hard to teach an old dog new tricks. So there's going to be continuities in any life and any scholar. I'd say, a bit of my rage at Cold War intellectuals probably gets transferred to gerontocracy. And my critique of them is the same, really, that they're kind of foreclosing the future. That really is my main argument in both books. And so you're right to sense that there's somehow a kinship between the projects.
How did we end up with the situation? I mean, the first time I was in America during the elections was this past November, like a year ago, right? Or
Right.
year and 3 months ago, because I have a great talent at timing. And it was really, really weird to watch all these old people. I mean, even the young candidate was like 60 years old.
Right.
And to me, working in tech, working in culture, where there is so much youth and people move to this country and people, even drop out of university famously to be able to start their companies even younger. They want to like become
Right.
founders or investors at 19. So how did America end up in this situation
Hmm.
where from the youth culture, from that incredible amount of hope that I see in retrospect surrounding the early boomer era, how did we end up with political gerontocracy? I mean, it's kind of bizarre and quite unique, right? Is there another
Yeah.
place in the world where the Senate is kind of senile?
Um, well, okay, great questions. I guess I could start by saying that I don't want to say that every element of American culture and politics have become gerontocratic, but business has, and I observe at some length that Silicon Valley is kind of like the exception that proves the rule, or tech. If we look at like CEOs and business founders more generally, they're getting older and older on average. Um, of course, other domains, like TikTok culture could be like firmly in the hands of younger generations. I think the basic answer, and it's not like rocket science, is that um, our advanced societies are just much older than historically. People live longer and longer. The lifespans have been extended, and I devote a whole chapter to how that happened and how extraordinary it was. And um, the a consequence of like advancement and wealth is also that um, people are having fewer children. So what it means is that the whole demographic structures of these societies are shifting and there are more old people absolutely and relatively. And so in a way, that's a could be a defense of more elder power in government or elsewhere. But what I try to show is that it's gone so far and is so disproportionate to those who aren't old that exists that we really need to check in on it. And so most of the book is devoted to first documenting how pervasive older politicians are, not just in the presidency or in Congress, but the judiciary as well. But then I think the major innovation of the book is just to provide the receipts about how elder power, because it's really caused by demographic change, is pervasive in other ways. And I have a whole big section of the book about the voters. Um, who are far older than politicians. And indeed, if you have old voters, it almost doesn't matter as much how old the politicians are. I'm not saying it's unimportant and it's like a wedge issue. It gets our attention, Biden and Trump, but we need to kind of focus on voters and then wealth, including jobs and land, the control of those things by older and older people in an astonishing way. And I can cite the stats that you have in front of you if, for the others if they like. It's just gobsmacking. So then we're really dealing with something that's kind of snuck up on us, in part because it's part of an otherwise good thing, which is living longer. Who wouldn't want it?
I mean, we have a global audience here, and in a moment, I will just open the floor, and you're very welcome to raise your hands and jump in with questions or ask in the group chat in the Zoom chat. I will go there. But it's so interesting. I remember when Prince Charles became King Charles, and he's like
Mhm.
ancient. He's like
Yes.
a young king. He's like 100 years old. And then I was thinking, like, yeah, because the whole hereditary monarchy system was not designed for longevity. It was not designed for kings dying or queens dying at age 112, but when you would like fall in a battle at 19 and a half and your infant son would somehow get a regent and wind up on the throne and get married. And so it clearly calls for some kind of reimagining of the system. Last Sunday, we did a play reading with the playwright Matthew Gazda. He wrote a new play about Brian Johnson, the longevity influencer. And
Right.
afterwards, I came home and I was reading your book, book and I thought like, oh my God, Sam kind of wrote a book about the history of American longevity in some sense
Right.
and all the second order effects that people weren't like other than Prince Charles who knew this was coming. Nobody else really contended with the effects of. I mean, it's true in, Kyla Scanlon was just on Interintellect, and she was talking about the millennial plight of like, I'm a
Hmm.
millennial, and my generation will inherit when we are 75, when our
Right.
112-year-old parents pass away. And
Right.
and so these systems just no longer serve the fewer kids, longer lives reality of humans. And I
Totally.
find like in your book, you are actually giving us like stratagems of how to deal with. I mean, it's in the subtitle as well, because something needs to change. Otherwise, all you will have is discontent, resentment, all the negative emotions and hatred and counter elites and uprisings. So I'm really curious how you see this system having changed as, you as a legal scholar and intellectual historian, where do you might see like easier routes into change or maybe good historical examples for this where people solved the problem?
So, I was really inspired in not just by my own, father and father-in-law, but also by the show Succession. But it's because I realized that it was really a parable of all families and really of American society writ large, waiting on elders to pass and give us their stuff that they're hoarding.
Which is horrible
And
for the elders as well. I mean, do
it
you
is horrible.
think Charles and Queen Elizabeth had a good relationship? That's a terrible setup. Like, hey, mom, how are
exactly.
you
I
doing this
mean,
morning? Hope really badly. Like, that's terrible for a family.
exactly. And it's your point that King Charles, got a raw deal by having to wait around so long. Now, I'm against monarchy, so it's not like I'm going to shed many tears for someone like that. But your point is that he is us, and we are him, and we're the characters on Succession. And so, and that's why I focus so much on how pervasive this is. If it were, in a sense, just our politicians, there would be an easier fix. But if it's all the voters who are determining policy, and where the stats are just extremely graphic in that domain, and especially if it's who holds wealth, especially wealth in land and housing in particular, um, but also certain jobs in certain professions like mine. So I was also inspired by witnessing how universities became senior centers and blocked the ascent of younger people in ways that are extraordinary. So you're right that like that's it's a phenomenon that's very scary, and I think we should identify what's the problem with it. Um, and I think one big problem you've identified is like it's unfair to those who don't kind of have to wait around for benefits. Now, you could say the elders earn those things, and if they're alive, they should get to decide how long to keep them. Um, but what I think is the more kind of devastating view is that, well, who are you when you inherit your power when you're so old? Well, you're unlikely to be creative, dynamic, and innovative as you were before. You waited too long for that, even if you have 50 years ahead of you. If your predictions of living to 112 end up right. So I sort of think society suffers if we don't put more of the overall power in the hands of the younger people who are likely to provide the orthogonal moves, not the repetitive moves that our brain involves when we're older. Now, longevity science is very central to the book. And I have to say that my response to Brian Johnson and all of those people is kind of existentialist, that we should accept our mortality and the aging that leads to it in most cases now, extreme aging, and, that means like understanding that we have life stages and we should reinvent old age as one that is about losing power, maybe accepting the proximity of death, but also, becoming new kinds of people than we were before. We might not, get to be president if my proposals succeed, but we might get other good stuff.
You want to create an age cap on that. I wonder how that will fit.
Totally. Yeah, so we can get into the remedies, but I sort of think the conditions for change, I don't have any good or unique views about those because they're the same as always. I think I'm hoping that, like, along with a lot of other signs, there's kind of a movement emerging to challenge gerontocracy, and I'm trying to like give it a name and some arguments. Um, I could be a dud, but my take is that we need books like this in order to help, join conversations rather than like make immediate change. But for in way more than anything else I've written, I just provide like long laundry lists of things we could do if we were concerned about these problems.
And many of these methods seem to be working. I mean, we're talking about allowing people to enjoy an increasingly long period of life, which is retirement. And I often think about, when people talk about the fertility crisis, I always think about grandparents. Like a lot of
Yes.
my friends complained that they had kids and they counted on the grandparents to be there, and the grandparents were not there, and for two reasons. And for me, those two reasons kind of exemplify, and this is not just in the US, but also in, for instance, Western Europe, they kind of exemplify these two competing trends that are going on. One is the traditional, more like mid-century up to like maybe the 80s ideal, which is the happy, productive, promiscuous retirement, right? Where
Right.
you cash out of capitalism, you worked super hard at the same company for like 40 years or raised your kids at home and never went anywhere, whichever it was. And then you can retire with your spouse or get a new spouse and go on a cruise ship or move to Florida and start wearing really weird outfits and embarrass your grandchildren at scale. And some of my friends don't have access to the grandparents because the grandparents are on a cruise ship all the time or like in Nepal having fun. And they are like, well, we work, now you work. The other half of people, and this seems to be an increasing group, the grandparents work. It's like my
Yes.
father is, I don't know, says my friend is a dentist. They have a dentist practice, like it's their business. The
Sure.
son is not a dentist, so there's no succession. And the father is going to like die in somebody's mouth, you know? Like that's the plan. I'm sorry, like die drilling. And
Yes.
they will
Yes.
not be like, oh, at 2 p.m. I'm available to like hang with your kid. And so it's just a very like it goes against a lot of the expectations, right? The reality is different from what people expect.
Totally. So, I have a whole chapter about basically people not retiring, and the data is staggering. And, I think um, I delve into a lot about how we got here, but because it used to be that there was mandatory retirement. Now it's just for air traffic controllers and pilots. Um, and we can debate the merits of that kind of policy in different sectors, but I just think it should be far more widespread, not just for pipeline issues, but also for those, but like to renovate, the profession, um, but also because you know, it seems as if a liberated, wealthy, elderly class could be doing other socially useful things
Yeah.
than kind of holding down their jobs. Now, I don't want to get totalistic about it because there might be professions in which, like elementary school teaching, where it's very hard to find staff. Because it's so poorly paid that nobody wants to do it, where you wouldn't want mandatory retirement. And then there might be like, what if there's someone who's it's just their vocation to do whatever it is, and they can't imagine like giving it up? Well, what do we do about such cases? I think it's worth like a thought, some thinking. But I think, across the board, abandonment of mandatory retirement was a terrible mistake. And I closed the book really with an almost utopian vision of a retirement that's funded adequately, that people really could reinvent themselves towards the end, including for the sake of their own progeny, their grandchildren or great grandchildren, but also other socially useful tasks that others aren't doing because they are building their own, families and careers.
And one quick question, just related. So, Professor, what did you make of Rahm's recent proposal, which was rather topical, right, with this upcoming intern?
Totally.
Are you optimistic that something like that could ever get traction?
I think it's tough at the federal level because it seems as if as long as the Supreme Court's in charge, it would require a constitutional amendment to add an age limit for federal office. But what was right about his proposal, which is also in my book, Age Limits for Office, is that it wasn't just about the presidency.
Right.
But about all political offices, including he must have meant judges, because what are the consequences? I mean, the judiciary at the federal level is probably the worst of all the branches in gerontocratic terms. And it's not just Ruth Bader Ginsburg, um, but like, all the way down the federal judiciary. So I tweeted or whatever we're calling X tweets now that I, am totally in favor of Rahm's proposal. It's just that he probably doesn't understand that it would require some pretty creative thinking or um, like an amendment to the Constitution if push came to shove. So that's what we're up against, and I think we have to be honest about it.
You also warn against ageism, though, in the book, and there is an
For sure.
interesting kind of double crux here where, we're talking about retirement, and I remember when I was, a kid, I knew that there are some professions where you have to retire super early, like if you're a ballerina or a model
Of
or
course, of
an
course.
air traffic operator. Like, there is this joke in Paul Hoffman's book on Erdős that, when you're a mathematician, you can be a young genius, but you can't really be a young genius historian because you have to read many tens of thousands of pages of books
Yes.
and you will age into that. And I remember when I was choosing my profession, I was like, I want to choose something that I know I will be able to like keep getting better at. But older people will complain that there is huge ageism. I mean, not just in academic hiring, even in academic hiring, which should be completely gerontocratic in some areas. But like, I mean, in my field, definitely.
Yes.
How do you see this contradiction or paradox? And do you think that you resolved this? Is there something like a takeaway that people can muse
I
about?
mean, I hope I resolve it in the abstract, but of course the details are going to be very messy. But my basic approach to this is that ageism is real, but age discrimination is not about discrimination against the elderly alone, because it can turn out that our policies can be stacked against everyone but the elderly, and give the elderly excessive perquisites. And so I totally take your point about um, especially how the intersection of discrimination by age and discrimination by gender. Of course, women had the most to complain about when it came to gerontocracy because it was basically so intertwined with patriarchy. And so, like, there's a feminist argument against gerontocracy, and there's a feminist argument against ageism. And instead of seeing them as opposed, we have to see them as going together. And so, my basic idea is let's figure out what we owe older people, and I think the answer is a lot. And one thing we owe them is an end to unfair discrimination. But we also need to fairly discriminate against old people when they have too much power in the various ways that I, illustrate. In a century ago, it was very clear that older people were among the most oppressed in all societies and in American society. Um, Intersectionally, like it was worse to be old and female and black, but like some of the worst off, like in their suffering, were older people. But that's kind of changed night and day. And if we look at how children are treated, how much money is spent on children, what funds and social interest is put behind launching people into the prime of life, it just pales in comparison to the amount uh, uh, given to older people. And part of the reason is that older people have a lock on democracy. It's really not democracy. Elections are really a story about older people funding candidates to an extraordinary degree and disproportionately voting for policies they won't see, but that nonetheless benefit them to an extraordinary degree. So I'm basically saying ageism is real, but so is discrimination against everyone else on the basis of age. So if we're going to take ageism seriously, it has to be all of it.
It's interesting that, you kind of like overlay this with the feminist struggle, because that's definitely an ex like when I talk about age with women, and of course like my job is to talk to people, so I get a lot of data, anecdotal and otherwise. It really tells a completely different story. And there's something in women that somehow, and maybe the women here, please correct me if I'm completely wrong about this, but this has been my experience talking to you, that there is like you're trying to age out of something deliberately. Like you're aging yourself in some sense. I mean, makeup itself is a way to age your face, right? Because makeup makes you look 30 when you're 20. And there's like you kind of want to show yourself to be in the prime of life. And for a young woman, I mean, all you try to do, famously, Elizabeth Holmes, like lowering her voice, like all of that is to look older, right? You put on heels, you dress like respectable dressing for a woman is dressing as an older woman. So you have this narrative that as a young woman, you are more valuable because you are more fertile, or you can be more treated as a property for people, whatever. Amazing argument somebody might have consciously or subconsciously. But you know that if you want to participate in the economy, if you want to be taken seriously as an intellectual, you have to either be older or you have to act older in a very convincing and kind of consistent way. But for men, this is a very different story. And there is a whole respectability category intellectually for young men. And this is not just, a technocratic invention. This was so during the Romanticism. It was so in the time of Octavian. Jesus wows the elders with how eloquent he is at age 13 at the temple. So there is this like a man is supposed to be precocious in a very different way. And I think we carry that. I mean, I'm in my 40s and I feel myself carrying this strange double standarded burden across different countries that I've lived. It's everywhere. Some countries have more of the hots for the older woman, like English people with Thatcher and the Queen and M, or in Portugal you go and it's like an elderly matriarchy, but like it's in some flavor, it's there everywhere combined. Ageism and sexism somehow creates its unique combinations. So I'm so curious how you think about it. I mean, you recommend the book to men, right? Not for your mother and your mother-in-law. So when you think about the problem with age, to you, it's
Right.
a very masculine thing.
Well, I'd say, I am a man, so I may have privileged that slightly, but honestly, I feel like I was inspired equally by these feminist concerns. Maybe I interpret them in a somewhat different way. If you turn the page from where you were on the dedication, the epigraph comes from a female character in the show industry who says, "I'm bored working for this dictatorship of dying men." And to me, that would be like an amazing, like it would have a gendered element. And I was rewatching Game of Thrones the other night, and the young woman Ygritte, who's briefly Snow's consort, north of the Wall, tells him, "You don't need to live your whole life taking commands from old men." That another red-haired character, woman Shiv in Succession, says sometimes you just need a good old-fashioned dinosaur call. So to me, like this is in a way, if not as more relevant than as relevant to women. Maybe I would just
And
add
this
to your
shows
story.
that, like, in order to write good books, you have to watch good television.
Oh, totally. I'm
Sam
I'm
proves this.
this was totally a book that it was helped by streaming up to a point. But the only thing I would add to your account, which is really interesting, is just this kind of conventional feminist view, which is that And it's in my book when I talk about Susan Sontag's response to these issues. She basically said what many people, many feminists have said, which is that there's this double standard where, men are allowed to think that they age like bottles of wine and only get better. Uh, and we know that that's not just true in their career perquisites, but in the women they try to attract. Whereas women, yeah, are not only treated as less competent all the way through their careers, but their whole social value, because of patriarchy and sexism, is so tightly linked to something that is evanescent. So, she says, Susan Sontag says, it's very interesting. She says, we're not just concerned about age, um, because we're mortal, just like everyone else, and facing mortality. She wasn't even 40 years old, and she says women experience growing older, actually everything that comes before one is actually old, with distaste and shame. And that's just not the male experience. And so to me, like restoring more power to younger people, than they've enjoyed lately would be like a feminist victory. But I don't want to mansplain, since there are women on the call and they should say, whether they agree with any of this.
I'm curious, can I put the women on the spot here very uncharacteristically, just because we're talking about this? I'm so curious, as you think about the matter of the old leaders of the world. And I think this is a very pertinent question right now because, I mean, Kamala lost and we're left with these dudes mostly, right? I mean, you go on Twitter, you open the New York Times, and I'm sorry to say, we see old male leaders and young dead women, which is maybe not the most natural way of things. Now, and she's in London. Now you're in London, right? So you have like a
Yes.
whole insight on King Charles that we don't.
Oh my God. I actually had just moved to London when she died. I was in a pub. It was dramatic. Um, Sorry, I have so many thoughts, Samuel, and I'm really sorry. I'm gonna rant for a little
Okay,
bit.
sure. Yeah, please.
One is I think the recent elections have made us think a lot about gerontocracy
Yes.
in the political context, but I almost feel like the recent elections have been outcome of systems uh, more than they are about age, if that makes sense. Because when I look at elections, what I notice is that people actually genuinely do want, at least for male candidates, they do like young men standing, and you'll notice that they win quite often. It is not true for women. I think women have a very hard time in American politics. It's a big surprise to me that America hasn't had a single female like president. It's quite tragic, and it tells you something very interesting about the country. I can't
Yes.
quite tell what it is, so I won't say anything to it. But I can tell you that in UK, it's so easy to feel more included as a woman, at least in the civic and political process, I feel like people
Hmm.
actually talk to you even if they aren't interested in you romantically about
Hmm.
intellectual topics, which I find quite interesting. And obviously cities are a different thing, but like on the national stage, if you put a female leader on a national stage, everybody embarrasses themselves. I've seen people that I respect say terrible things. There was a time there were like these horrendous memes about Alexandra AOC on Twitter with like Elon Musk, and like it was just like gross. It was just gross at so many levels, and so many
Hmm.
people were like engaging in it as if it was funny. But I thought this is just a way to like push all the ways in which like uh, all the ways in which like people like push women out of political process, like using their youth is like a big part of it, which is why I think some women feel more comfortable after 40s engaging in civic life because people feel, I guess, more gross within themselves to like portray them this way. But I think internet is quite violent towards women. I think a culture, I don't know what it is about American culture that does not accept female power. Maybe because you guys said founding fathers. I don't know what it is. I can't quite say. But the
I
gerontocracy,
also feel this, by the way. Like I was very shocked when I came here that
yeah,
there's a specific kind of American sexism, and it is very, very
Mm,
gender-ocratic.
it
mm.
is very
But I did not
specific.
expect at all because I was like,
No.
Aaron Sorkin is so nice to smart women, and I thought that was more widespread. But no,
It's very
I
interesting.
also watch good TV.
Yes. I actually love Succession for the way it portrays the female characters as well, because Shiv is the female characters in it are very varied. They have their
Yes.
uh own moral feelings. They're powerful in their own way. They use their power, and it's very interesting that way. But I'm actually not convinced that like a specific retirement age in specific professions is always the best idea. And why I think this way is that I think sometimes that the age and power correlate with the longevity of an institution. So Apple has a very old CEO right now because Apple has existed for a long time. There are people who have worked at Apple since they were 14 years old. That's the oldest Apple employee. If that person ever was to become a CEO, you cannot tell me that he's gonna be the bad choice. I think it is probably an okay choice to make in certain contexts. Um, you'll notice that, I mean, startups favor young people. I don't know what's happening with American democracy and the political establishment that like older people have come to forefront, but at least for male candidates, I think if they made younger male candidates stand up in elections and give them the same media push, I think they will succeed. I don't know what's happening. Like, I couldn't tell you what's happening. Like, why are not more young people part of the actual power establishment? And why is like that a problem? Because it seems like when they run, they generally win.
So everything you said is really interesting, and I just want to be clear, like this is not a book that says there's one source of oppression. It's saying actually in a lot of talk about intersectionality, one cause has been left out too frequently, and it's age-based oppression. And that could be oppression visited on older people, but it also could be oppression visited for the sake of older people on everyone else. And um, I mean, you're reporting a lot of anecdotes, which are really interesting. I just want to be clear. My main concern is not about politicians. That's what the discourse is about. And I'm basically trying to say, well, if that's your problem, why aren't you concerned about the voters who are even more age skewed upwards, or capitalism, which if we look at who holds wealth and especially landed and house wealth and other kinds of economic power are skewed upwards. So that's my main attempted contribution. Um, I'm with you that maybe we shouldn't have mandatory retirement in all sectors or in many sectors. I'm saying it really depends on the sector. Um, I think, what we would have to debate in the end is like, because as I mentioned, outside tech, the age of leaders of businesses and founders of businesses have been trending older. Like, what are the consequences of that for the dynamism of an economy? On your kind of like I don't want to like single out America either. I think I mentioned that gerontocracy is a global problem, and this demographic change is certainly of global significance. I mean, it's not the United States, which has the highest life expectancy, never has. And so I think that we would have to do very detailed study of the UK and everywhere else. I haven't done it. But what we can't do is like just yeah, yeah, like not study it and say my impressions are this or that, because it's just stories. I love stories, and as we discussed, I'm like we should all be totally inspired by those stories, and I love Shiv too. But in the end, we have to know like what does the data show about each society? How are they similar? How are they different?
Thank you so much. I want to go into a different part of the book, but before that, we will take Stephanie's question very quickly.
I think you're muted, Stephanie.
You're
So
muted.
Sorry, at least one person has to do that in every Zoom
yeah,
call. So I think I'll throw my 2 cents in about, the inherent misogyny that is just embedded in our culture,
right.
that attractiveness and beauty is a currency that cuts women both ways.
Hmm.
And so, and I imagine this happens in a lot of countries, not just the United States, but growing up, you have the awkward experience as you get older as a woman that eventually no one's catcalling you on the street anymore. Like you experience that as a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old. And then one day you notice it's not happening anymore. And it's like you aged out of sexual harassment, right? And so it's an interesting experience as a woman going through that. And the reason it cuts both ways is that when you're younger and you have the beauty currency, you might get a male mentor that will help you with your career because he wants to be adjacent to your looks, right? And as you get older, where men might experience a boon from being aged and wise, women are not getting that same boon. At least that's been my experience.
Yes.
Older women sometimes are seen as ridiculous or Karens or whatever, and that happens more and more. But my question for you, not to change the topic, is and it seems from what you're saying that you think the issues are interrelated, but isn't the bigger problem plutocracy, at least in the United States?
Yeah.
Or do you think gerontocracy and plutocracy are interrelated and inseparable?
Well, okay, so such great questions, and your comments were amazing too. Just to start with those last things, you know, I'm t totally down, and everything you said resonates. I have two daughters, and they really have had these experiences that, like, are searing in the direction that you're suggesting. At the same time, I think we have to note that the situation of women has been revolutionized to an extent. And we now have iconic women who are old, like Nancy Pelosi and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And, the latter's bet on her mortality ended up sadly setting women's rights back 50 years. So, like, there can be real examples of women who become old and powerful enough to experience cognitive decline, to lose the race against time that, we're all playing with death. And so it can't be that, um, like, critiquing patriarchy can force us to leave out the way in which gerontocracy can also now be exercised not just by old men, but old women. So that's just a preliminary comment. But no, I mean, you've answered like your question because as I see it, um, like, there's a famous saying that I cite from a great, UK social theorist named Stuart Hall that race is the modality in which class is lived. And basically, I think we have to conclude that age also is a modality in which classes live because there are a lot of age specific laws that we would find abhorrent in the context of race because they privilege older people and protect them overly. And no one thinks there's a problem. And we would expect wealth and age to correlate just because you accumulate more stuff and you have the right in capitalist society to keep it to the end. But the extent of it now is just unbelievable. If we look at things like what's the medium age of home ownership? Are families getting to live in homes they own? How easy is it to acquire a home? especially in highly desirable urban cores. If you look at New York, especially Manhattan, but not only, parts of Brooklyn already, like the average age has skyrocketed in the last 30 years to the point that because the housing is so expensive, it's impossible for younger people, especially people who have other expenses, to buy into the neighborhood. And so we've done things across the North Atlantic that go so far as creating like whole cities that are coming close to being like urban senior centers, with younger people forced to the margins of these. So like, I don't see there being a way of attacking plutocracy as we know it without attacking gerontocracy because they're completely interrelated, as you said. And so I want to resist the temptation to say, oh, there's some other real problem like class rule or patriarchy. No, those things are real. And the fact that they're real means we should care about how much they're bound up with gerontocracy.
I'm so curious about this idea of social utility outside economic utility. I find that in today's world, this is almost an unbelievable concept. But that there is, and I
Yes.
wrote, I think, the second essay on my new Substack that I'm writing about America. I argue that it's okay in a democratic system for families to not be fully democratic,
Mhm.
because there is some weird process in which the more you equalize the family, the more you might push out those instincts for unfairness into the wider world. And I always marveled at the fact that, in a multi-generational family, there are members who are not economically useful, and that's fine. There is, in fact, a social utility to be outside the economic machine, which all religions have always known, because the oracles and the priests and the nuns and the Vespa virgins and whatever were always kind of outside the kind of daily treadmill of production. And that there is wisdom, insight, neutrality, good judgment that can be associated with staying outside of it. And I find that the more we keep the elders in the kind of the hustle, the less detachment we will get from them.
Mhm.
We talk about mentors, like it has been my frequent, you know, bewilderment that you try to get mentors, but the mentors are still competing.
Right.
So you get more into this Girardian model setup where it's not just a role model, but eventually kind of your rival. And it shouldn't be. Like it was, I liked that my grandmother was not competing with me and just told me how to get suitors. I don't know. There is a social utility to that. And I find that we need to almost rebuild a vocabulary for what it means to be beneficial in society, without that also entailing some kind of economic output. You don't have to have an economic output when you're a child, but with children we have this kind of like projected economic output, right? Like that's why you invest so much in your children. But with the elders, like, can there be a stratum almost in society? I mean, this is what you're asking, that we kind of leave alone and that there
Right.
is an intellectual value to that that has nothing to do with return.
I love that, and I think it's very deep. You know, I in the book I toy with the idea that um, since we've already gone furthest towards socialism with respect to, welfare for elderly people, even when they don't need it because they're actually very, they're still working or they have a lot of independent wealth. We could imagine kind of hewing out a zone of less commodified life and less capitalist kind of you know like dominated life for elderly people first, as like a model, and then maybe more people would like to incorporate limits in their own lives when they're younger towards these concerns. But I also toy with this other idea, which is that if we are going to insist on depriving older people of some of their perquisites and power, we should be offering them something in return. And what I think you're saying, which is a kind of different way of saying it than I do, is that what we should envision for them is like an exit from just the economic kinds of valuation of what's worth doing in life. And I think that's really appealing because, no one is like when they're on their deathbeds is doing stock trades. They when they're facing
Talk about your
mortality.
own friends, Sam, okay? My
Sure, fair enough.
friends are trading with
Maybe
their death.
maybe yours are, but I just think that like the existentialist thread in the book is really about saying, well, what's really worth doing? And elderly people have a potential to instruct us about what could really matter. But of course, they have to be freed from this syndrome of hoarding and dominating.
And
Is
you can
that a uniquely American phenomenon in some respects? There's this culture of capital accumulation, right? Everyone
Yeah,
thinks about retirement, but it doesn't seem to be a good vision for anyone. No one wants
yeah.
to go there. They're just holding on and accumulating capital and assets.
I think Western Europe and especially continental and Nordic Western Europe, they have much more desirable forms of retirement culture. And that's not unrelated to the fact that they have much more functional welfare states. So I don't want to like suggest that they're socialist utopias, but I think America stands out in the way in which, in part because you're going to be largely on your own as you age, you have the temptation to kind of commit wholeheartedly to this acquisition ethic before you're there. And then you don't give it up because it's the source of your meaning and
It's
it's the
stature.
source of your, so yeah, totally.
it's so
So
why.
that's why I think we have to provide alternatives. And I think
Right.
some European things can inspire. And it's also notably Europe that has the least incidence of elderly politicians. It's not just an American phenomenon, but it's China, Russia, much of Africa. But Western Europe is kind of today the bright spot in having relatively younger politicians than most of the rest of the world. It's not a bright spot in this demographic picture, because it's actually Western Europe is much more like East Asian countries that have gone furthest in basically reducing the number of children and increasing the number of older and older people. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only place that's like a counterexample to that trend, which is pervasive everywhere else.
And it's already like getting messed up down there as well. This is so interesting, but also you look at these like daily schedules in Florida where some grandparents do move and they have like the whole day is like all these activities, like when you're a child and you're in camp and you have to go like speed walking and stuff. And I much prefer like Italian grandmas just drinking sherry in the sun all day, gossiping. Like you don't have to do activities anymore. You've already like contributed to society. Like
Right, right, right.
enjoy. Now I will take the question and then we will move to the last section of the conversation.
Thank you. I wanted to emphasize the part about cultural script that Charlie brought up, and you agree with Samuel, which is that um, if the society places a lot of value on material wealth and where you stand at that, in that, if there is the only axis at which you gauge a life, people are going to try to maximize it till the end. So I think that missing. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think it actually comes back to architecture of cities in America. Uh, it is only when people are in proximity across age groups and across different phases of life that they can actually help each other and understand each other better. I imagine if the grandparents didn't leave for Florida and also lived in, like 2 kilometers away, people would get much more support. This whole uh, if the cultural script has been that you retire with your own peer group in a specific place and do these presidential schedule kind of thing that's published and you follow
Yes.
it, then it's a very different thing. Like then every person who's getting older has to consciously design their retirement to be different from it. So I think
Yes.
the cultural script and the way families surround uh, themselves with each other actually can make a lot of difference. Um, uh, Personally, I feel like it is a miss for every age group when they don't
Yes.
see how life. Sometimes when I look at like really old women in the swimming pool, it makes me so happy because it allows me to know what it means to grow old. Otherwise, in my profession, I see people more or less around my age or much younger, which doesn't tell you what's gonna happen to you in future. So seeing old women makes me really happy. It's very comforting in a way that's hard to describe. And so I feel like,
In London, in some areas, there are no old people at all, and it's so weird. I live on the Upper West Side in New York, and like
yeah,
the median age on my street is like 99.7, and you can have a conversation with somebody about the American Civil War, and they will have some personal memories about it. I love it.
that's
So good. And they like
incredible.
hang out. They have lunch at like the
Yeah.
diner at 11:15 a.m. every day. It's great. Dinner at 4.
Yeah. But I think that actually I think it really changes how age groups interact with each other. And some of the hoarding actually comes from that disconnect as well. And one thing I wanted to mention is that respect is also a currency. And when younger generations don't respect older people have less of an incentive to act in favor. And the way, in my opinion, patriarchy and gerontocracy are related is that um, obviously men guide younger men through various stages of power. And I think the implicit understanding is that when that person is in line to get power, they are not gonna snatch it. Like otherwise, the old will just kill the young when they are young and defenseless. It happens in Animal Kingdom. And so I feel like it's the rite of passage that's provided by men to other men also protects gerontocracy. And I think it's just like um I think it's like a bit of a reinforcing thing as well. Um,
Co-option, basically.
Yeah, but I really think cities are the answer.
Mm.
Put people together. That's my agenda.
I love that, and it's all very, very pertinent. There was a lot. I'll just make a couple of comments. One is just that, in the book I talk about how American cities were fragmented, and there were like specific like legal techniques that people have used to create municipalities so that they don't have to interact with people across the line. And classically that was so they could be in a white only city. Um, but we also have much evidence that older people move across lines so that they can have lower taxes and not pay for the schooling of younger people who aren't their own children or grandchildren. And I wouldn't, before you make up your mind, I wouldn't underestimate how shocking the data is about how little older people with means want to pay taxes and how intense their strategies are, including the one I just mentioned, to avoid paying taxes. And that like is it wasn't something I had thought much about, but and it's not something I'd ever worked on any topic, but the data is overwhelming. I totally agree with you that different rules that would force people to live together and be interdependent, including in paying taxes if they have, the means, would be like an extraordinary thing. Um, the reference to the animal kingdom is really interesting and I think could take us too far afield, but I do a lot with ethnography and with like studies of how youth and age relate in the animal kingdom. And one thing I'll just say is that in both settings, I think we like have to appreciate that respect for the older, which is pervasive in human cultures, is like a cultural imperative that we have to think really hard about. You're right about children, kind of they could potentially be preyed upon by older people. but young men and women are generally more powerful than their elders physically. And yet most cultures we know of found cultural ways of encouraging them to submit and indeed transfer assets, including like the best food and so forth, to older people. And so that's not an example of like using vitality to lord over it. It's using cultures like myth making stories in the African tribal context. I mentioned curses um, to like encourage this gerontocratic outcome. So I think we just have to be like faithful to all the evidence and where it would take this conversation.
I mean, it's in the Ten Commandments, right? Gerontocracy is kind of included in the Judeo-Christian.
Sure. It's fascinating. Most myths do not attack old people. They present older people as where the people in whom power should lie. So it's kind of like myth is generally not ageist. It's the other way around, if by that we mean discriminatory against older people.
Yeah. I mean, there is an argument that, respect for elders is a primarily kind of pre-literacy phenomenon that we kind of like kept within our culture in a Hegelian dialectical way and kind of passed it
Uh-huh.
down.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Because before literacy, you needed somebody who remembers what plant is poisonous. And so, but old people at the time meant probably much younger than I am right now. So it just meant that, I don't know, 35, just somebody who remembers. Um, but I mean, it is a good thing about our society that we care for the weak, whether they are very young or very old. And you argue beautifully that, that should be that actually like allowing people to retire in a dignified and sociable way is a part of elder care in your system. And it's actually kind of a dick move to keep people working until they're 90 because they don't see a way out to be active and engaged and social unless employed. And I think this is a good way to segue also to the last thing that I wanted to discuss today, which is the matter of money. We kind of tiptoe around this question, whether that's about, succession or sexism or urbanization. There's a sentence in the book that is just like so eminently quotable that you say just like wealth is not spread evenly across the age spectrum, which is to say that age inflects class hierarchy. And I would love to have you say a little bit more about this. There's also, I mean, if you allow me to read up, there is a beautiful double paragraph that I felt really kind of encapsulates this whole question. Is it okay if I just add this here?
Oh, sure, if you like. Yeah.
Um, it's like I think it's the summary of one of the later chapters. You say aging politicians serve an aging electorate, and changing rules does nothing to unseat the power behind the throne. If their bidding is done anyway, graying voters might tolerate younger servants. In an aging society, the politicians are less of a problem than the voters, who have helped make modern gerontocracy possible and shifted the very meaning of democracy in a new direction. That is why new movements and, if it happens, a younger political class will have to reform American elections piece by piece so that old people do not dominate them so thoroughly. Campaign finance reform would prevent seniors from spending their way to a compliant political order. Making it easier for busy people to go to the polls would improve youth turnout. Such fixes would begin to cut off the electoral bluff that the AARP, that you write a lot about in the book, makes in purporting to stand for all elders who might administer a tremendous electoral vote if crossed. So here we have basically in the third of the book, a lot on money and the many ways that being employed during the day prohibits some younger people, for instance, to go to vote. And I often find that this is all about money and time. If you run an online community than I do, you know that if there is ever a problem, it's going to come from people who have too much time during the day. So what's going on with money and time in this system that you put together by the end of the book, and how can, for instance, changing campaign financing even happen? I mean, there are so many kind of contrasting incentives here.
Yeah, so we kind of addressed that. I think it's starting with Stephanie's second question, and there's just so much like to learn about this, and I only scratched the surface. But um, I think we can distinguish between. You talked a bit about the electoral context and maybe the political context more generally, and there I'm trying to say, okay, there are old politicians, but um, you know, the fact that seniors have more time means that it's not the politicians who at least are working, for allegedly for all, but seniors who are voting largely for themselves, um, are able to do so disproportionately, and it goes beyond this. It's not just campaign finance, which is start getting into wealth, and it's true that like the average age of the campaign donors in this country in the United States is 70. I mean, it's like even older than the average age of voters, which is in the mid 50s. Um, but the fact that people have time when they're older, including power to just leave their jobs for a few hours to do something, also means that they attend meetings. Um, and what I show in the book is that most of elder power is actually exercised through advocacy and self-advocacy at the local level and going to town meetings because, all education decisions and all zoning and land decisions are made for like terrible historical reasons in the United States at the local level. And basically, if you go to these town meetings, what are older people doing? Well, they're arguing against taxes. There are for schools. They're arguing against renovation of cities. Um, and that means that there's a housing crisis because housing doesn't get built. Amazingly, they even argue against construction of adequate senior housing. So they're discriminating on, in a sense, against the needier among their own age cohort. So that's an excellent example of the way that age-related power, namely to agitate and block change, intersects with class. And it means that the poor suffer, including if they're old, compared to the rich with means, but it's related to age, the power that is exercised against the aged themselves. So, I think there's so many examples of that. And then we get to what I call oligarchy, which is like this intersectional idea of age-related, like plutocracy. And again, we don't need to like cite info, but it's like the book is largely a compendium of like facts that are supposed to be shocking. And I think many are, and they have to do with yeah, like just like w w exactly how much of the country's wealth are held by older people, not just land and housing. So yeah, I mean, I maybe leave it at that, but it's really the deepest level of the book because, I operate with the theory that like politicians are going to do what the voters say, and then, it's not just the richer you are, the likely you are to vote, but the older you are, so that these things are all interrelated, and ultimately we should care most about the organization of the economy and who has wealth. The trouble is we can't do that without taking age seriously.
What are your thoughts? And this is like just thinking about the California NIMBYs. Uh,
Yes,
I mean, you spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, so you must be really familiar with this like aging hippies who now are sitting in these glorious little cottages that somehow cost
totally.
$20 million, and they're just like living there. It's kind of a wild thing for me to ever go there, coming from Europe where like people just try to build homes. That's kind of a no-brainer thing. And but there is this new movement, the abundance movement, that it seems
Yes,
to first of
yes,
all be a kind of multi-generational thing, and it's very common to see, I don't know, Ezra on stage with David Brooks. You have a kind
yeah.
of buy-in across the age spectrum. Are you do you have favorable opinions about them? I know there's some criticism that
Um,
a little bit elitist,
I'm
whatever.
trying to reclaim the abundance bros from their own mistakes.
Oh, that's the best way to do
I
it. Tell us.
I did write the review of the books in the New York Times, and I tried to like stake out a nuanced position. But my basic view is that, well, they're right in calling for creativity and dynamism. It's just that and calling for an end to the housing crisis. And my little input to that is you can't do it without facing the gerontocracy of these phenomena that they're so if you're concerned about, NIMBYism, you can't really understand it except as an age-related phenomenon. Because who's protecting neighborhoods against change? Well, it's not all neighborhoods, and it's and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, but at the core of abundance, I think if we could unlock and unleash it, is a new concept of liberalism that returns to the ideas after the French Revolution, when the notion was you don't get your station in life through like an old regime. You get it through being a creator and an innovator. And that's why I talk in the book about how the person who coined the term gerontocracy was this Frenchman after the French Revolution who saw the Restoration put all the old men back in power. And he basically like devised a brilliant critique of gerontocracy, which was really about how it wasn't so much that the king was old. I mean, King Charles was old. Louis the XVI was very young when he lost his head. The king after 1815, the couple before the next revolution were old. And he denounced them, but even more, he denounced that they'd set up a legislature of old men and that so few people who were old controlled the economy. And I'm basically trying to update that original set of arguments for our time. It's just that they're strikingly true of America, which was supposed to be different.
A lot of the book calls for kind of trying to find a way out. And
Yes,
I understand that, if I'm a political decision maker, this is what I can do. If I'm an old person, this is what you expect me to do. What
yes,
can we do who are still in the kind of deep,
yes,
of economic productivity, or at least an attempt thereof?
sure.
How can we create a world that is more equitable to older people in the sense that they can like enjoy the fruits of their previous labor and see, a happy, healthy, long life and possibly like grandchildren or great grandchildren being born. They get to spend time with them. Maybe they can feel socially extremely utile without having to participate in the drudgery of economic activity. But we also want to include the younger people in this process. First of all, because we need older people. As you start your book, this is a complicated thing. I think sometimes I think about how, in 25 years, all the boomers will be gone. And I'm not happy about that. Like, that's actually really scary. You don't want to be the oldest generation alive because then who can help? It's terrible. So it's clearly a two-way process. I mean, first of all, for yourself, like what do you personally do? And what do you recommend for us to do?
Well, so I think there's no magic bullet. So my thought is that there's a phase of consciousness raising, and I think like compared to 3 years ago, consciousness of gerontocracy has gone from non-existent to omnipresent. And I'm basically trying to say, yes, but Joe Biden was the tip of the iceberg because he was one politician, and it's not even politicians that are the main problem.
And
And
Trump said that he ruined old age for everybody, right?
he said that of Biden.
Yeah.
And so kind of an amazing, I
I
found
think
that
that
an
about
amazing
Trump, that
comment.
he ruined being an Eastern European woman for everybody.
Right. So I mean, what I do in the book is I kind of adopt the strategy that if I list enough implausible ideas, one has to survive. and be actionable. But the truth is that I don't have like an immediate plan of action. I think there are various things we can do, like lowering the voting age, which is not, prohibited by, the Constitution, which I denounce as part of the gerontocratic plot from the beginning that coexisted with America's commitment to youth, is a problem because it puts big constraints on the ease of any solutions. But there are some that are easy, like lowering the voting age, mandatory voting, mobilizing for higher taxes that could even be age correlated, blocking the significance of local decision making on education and housing. I mean, all of these could have like huge effects, but then there are bigger things I propose, like weighting votes so that your voting, the strength of your vote is not correlated with having a body just like someone of a different age does. Um, but that, you should be like, the question is, what stake do you have in the election? And if you're 20, you have 70 years of the policies you're voting for before you, whereas if you're 70, you have 10 or 20. And so why should you have the same vote on those matters? So those are some like edgier ideas, but there are probably 50 ideas in here. And the concept would be like pick one that you like and see if you can get anyone to take it.
Are you familiar with Glenn Wales' work?
Oh yeah, I've met him.
So the quadratic voting
Yeah,
system that he
totally. So
built.
he's a very interesting thinker. I mean, I think wrong-headed in some ways, but I think uh, like his ideas are of the same nature. Like they're basically like there's a problem. What would the ideal solution be? And then, you have to hope that there are takers. You can't just like presuppose a movement, and a movement can't presuppose ideas. So like you have to just like put things out there, and maybe the lightning will strike. I mean, how has change happened in the past that way? Doesn't mean that like you can't bet on any of this, but you can hope for it.
I really like this idea, and I think this is kind of the underlying question here, which is that, we have the system that we consider liberal democracy, and it was built and tweaked around a very specific, I mean, through the existential prism, a very like traditional assumed life cycle of what it means to be a human. When are you at your most productive? How long are you alive for?
Yes,
When are you at your wisest and most politically capable? And that has completely changed.
yes,
And that we
yes,
need to tweak the system around it because it's
totally.
like clothes. We today what used to be extra small is today small or something because people are bigger. Like,
Yes,
what are you going to do? Like, people can't wear that stuff. You have to change the product.
totally. I mean, I'm totally down with saying we should have new standards for our politics because we are just objectively older. And there are many good things about that, but then it's incumbent upon us to recognize the disadvantages, for creativity, distributive justice, like facing mortality, of a culture in which we're invited to think we live forever and certainly live a lot longer.
Amen. And Sam, thank you so much for joining us on Interintellect. And I really hope that more than one of your proposals, which are very reasonable, will find a kind of welcoming ground here. And yeah, I would love to see a debate between you and the abundance guys. Hopefully, a lot of young people will tune in. I think your ideas will be extremely welcome. I know for a fact, at least in my circles, that so many people are thinking about succession and talent,
Mm,
and not just like the gender divisions and the foreigner versus American divisions, but there are so many new class divisions that have suddenly appeared. They don't really have a nomenclature yet. We are talking about it. We don't know like who's the leader of what. They don't have a taxonomy yet. We don't know what is what yet. But I feel like we're getting there, and we need more such books that name what's happening in a more self-honest way.
Oh, thanks a million, and thanks to those who joined the Zoom and said such smart things.
Thank you very
So
much.
much, guys.
Thank you.
Have a lovely rest of the day and night, and
Thanks, Sam.
read
Anna,
Gerontocracy in
bye.
America and how
Bye,
to
Bye.
everyone.
we can avoid it. See you.
Okay, later on.